Good morning, this is Paweł Gregorczyk. This is another interview as part of the Future Builders project. Today we host Vita Teunissen, with whom we will talk about the Dutch School of Adaptive Architecture, where old buildings are given new roles while respecting their heritage. Why has this country become famous for its approach to renovation? That is what we will find out in this talk. But let's start with what the Future Builders project is. It is a unique space for dialogue about what design, architecture, construction and urban planning will look like in the future. We talk to experts in their fields who are also advocates for positive change. We hope that you find these interviews not only a dose of knowledge, but also an inspiration. The originator and sponsor of the Future Builders project is Aluprof. Our guest today, Vita Teunissen, is a partner at SteenhuisMeurs, one of the leading Dutch heritage research offices. She and her team are developing a broad approach to adaptive reuse, developed by the Dutch over the years. Vita is concerned with the future of buildings, urban areas and landscapes, basing her work on the belief that every place has a memory. SteenhuisMeurs has an advisory and research role for more than 600 locations across the Netherlands. A very warm welcome to you. I'm glad you accepted our invitation because such an international vision of what the future of architecture and urbanism should look like is also very important to us. A warm welcome again.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I always find it very interesting to discuss things internationally, so thank you too.
So let's start with the fact that the Netherlands has already become very famous in the international community for being very interested in building renovation projects and giving them new roles. I would like to ask you at the beginning about what the Dutch School of Building Adaptation is all about. Why did your approach become so famous all over the world?
Yes, I think maybe to start with this remark that for us, the question how to conserve a historic city or building is in fact a question how to transform that historic site without causing damage to its cultural values. So it's very much a sense of adaptive reuse. And this has a very historical foundation. We live in a very densely populated country. The sense it's in our blood. We have for ages, for centuries. And we have become quite advanced in making everything we have, both buildings and our land, continuously useful to us. We've made lakes into pastures, we've made wilderness into agricultural land, and this translates into our approach to the built environment. And I think if you realize that we have 100,000 protected monuments here in the Netherlands and 420 protected city and village scapes, 17% of our territory, so our country, has some sort of heritage protection. So it's very embedded in the way that we approach our environment, not only from maybe a government perspective, but also from a more commercial perspective.
So, where are the biggest challenges when it comes to adapting buildings to new roles? Where are the difficulties that you have to face?
There are many, of course, but all challenges have answers. I think currently a very big challenge is to adapt buildings to our new climate and to make them more sustainable. And the challenge there is that existing buildings all require let's say, a personalized solution. So there's no ready-made solution because all buildings that already exist are different. So for instance, in making a building more sustainable, there's a question of insulation, there's a question of making the facade more durable. And this is different than our maybe more standardized approach to building. So that is definitely one challenge. The other challenge is more of a design question, and that is to blend both old and new without compromise. So without compromise between the quality and the values of the existing building and the quality and the usefulness of the new additions. So that's a design challenge that we have in the Netherlands, and I think also elsewhere in Europe, different ways of approaching.
You mentioned the sustainability, and it is a question I wanted to ask later, but since you've raised it, I'd like to stay on this thread. How do you build or adapt buildings whose creators historically did not think at all about making them sustainable? In terms of adaptation, how do we achieve zero-emission construction and architecture in Europe?
Yes, that is definitely a question. And maybe the first point of view is that all buildings can change. You can keep the historic elements and the historic values in a building while making changes. But it's about taking the, let's say, the construction details of the historic building as your point of departure for the future. So maybe if you had to change a window frame, or if you had to add insulation, you study the historic details and think about how you can translate them into a way that fits into the future. So that's about the details of the thing. But here in the Netherlands, I think it's the same. So in some places in Poland, we have a big problem with water management. We are very advanced in it, in our water management. But with the large rainfall that we suffer now, the water comes much quicker. And that's actually interesting because here in the Netherlands, we have older castles with moats, you know, the hollow canals around, for instance, and you can reuse them now in a way that's different than they were used before. They were used to protect the castle, but now we can use them to protect ourselves and using them as a buffer to retain the water longer. So there's also, you know, you can look at different chances and how to reuse historic structures in a way that fit to our needs today.
It's a very interesting approach, but I've also heard that in the Netherlands you go in a different direction sometimes. If we have an office building, we want to adapt maybe not the building itself, but the space where the building was, then you tear down that building and build a new one that relates to the historical urban fabric. Is this also really the trend in your country?
It does happen sometimes, but there are some remarks I have to make here. One is that has become more valued in our community, in our society. So we are still studying ways to reincorporate those larger office buildings, for instance, as mentioned by you, in a way that incorporates different layers of time. So not completely demolishing it, but looking at it and thinking how we can adapt this to our current needs and views on beauty. But we do sometimes demolish. We are not saints. We do demolish sometimes. The only thing is that it hardly ever happens that a larger building is demolished and makes place for a building that has less floor space. We are, of course, dependent on financial and economical means. But what does happen if a new building is constructed and the new volume, even though it's as big or maybe even bigger, is positioned and morphed in a way that it fits in the scale of the surroundings. So you're adapting a larger block, let's say, and fitting it in to the rhythm and the composition of the surrounding buildings. There are many examples of this. They're very interesting to study, yes.
So, if I understand it correctly, this Dutch school of building adaptation is about looking to the future and the past at the same time. Because on the one hand, we have to look at the future role of the building, and on the other hand, respect its past?
Yes, that is a very good conclusion. That's completely what we're about. It's always about translating past values into the future. And a very important part of that is use. If a building cannot be used, it's very difficult to conserve it. So by introducing a new use that fits within the shell or within the meaning of the previous building, you're giving it a further future, let's say.
The adaptation of buildings is not only about very old buildings, but buildings from the 1970s, for example. They also require adapting the space to new roles, as they have become technologically obsolete, and perhaps their functions are also outdated. You mentioned in an interview that it's actually easier to catch that heritage of a younger building because that original thought of the architect is widely known. In these older buildings, it is much more difficult because there are many layers of history, there are many layers of purpose of those buildings that have changed over the years. In this case, when we adapt such a very old building, should we forget about these oldest layers because they are no longer relevant? Or is the original version of the building also something to which we should refer?
Yes, definitely. The older the building, the more layers it has, the more use it's had. And that's one very important challenge for the designer. What layer do you choose? Do you reference all historic layers, or do you maybe choose one that's the main story and add your new function to that? So that's a very interesting question, mostly for restoration or reuse architects. Now, you also mentioned more recent buildings. When it comes to more recent buildings, we know a lot more about the original thinking of the architects that designed the building and the client and the first user of the building. So we very quickly architecture meaning, and that is the way that you study a building. Of course, castles that are 8 centuries old, they have a much different, they require a very different approach for both the researcher, which is what I am, and to the architect. Yeah.
It's a bit like detective work, a historical detective.
Yes, that's we call ourselves that sometimes. We always start with archives. We go through different archives around the city and the country. We have beautiful ones here in the Netherlands, and we study as much as we can of the age where a building was constructed, and then take that into maybe ideas or requirements for the future. And then that's where the architect starts. You know, he studies our research and our tips for the future, and then he has of course, his own expertise of translating that further into the future. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What are the basic questions you need to ask yourself when you start work? Is there a list of questions that would perhaps also guide others who want to adapt buildings wisely?
Yes. It's always very important to study an historic site from 2 different approaches. One is spatial. You know, what are we dealing with here? Where is this building located? How did the surroundings develop themselves? Is there any ideas about the views of the architect or the client that constructed the building? So those are spatial questions. But we also always study what we call more associative or immaterial questions, non-material questions, which is what was the country like at the time? What was the collective sense on what was the view on maybe societal issues or political issues? Where did the building derive from? What ideas did it derive from? And how can you maybe be inspired by the ideas of the time in reconstructing the newer additions? So don't only look at the building and at the spaces, but also think about where this building has come from. And it's always very interesting for future users to know where you came from.
Why is this so important in your country? After all, every country has its own history and everyone wants to look after their heritage, and yet your example stands out in comparison with many other countries where you also adapt buildings wisely. Yet it is the Dutch approach that is the model. What is the reason for that?
Yes, before I answer your question, I think there's one thing that we all have in common, all countries, all people, and that is that the past tells us about our future. That by connecting to the past, we're connecting to each other, and it helps thinking about the future, which is insecure and unknown. But the thing is, in the Netherlands, in the post-war period, so post-World War II, after 1945, there was a movement of renewal, large-scale renewal, also in cities. You know, the car was the new way forward, and old buildings had to be removed to make space for cars and roads and all sort of futuristic infrastructure. That happened sometimes, but there was also much protest in the Netherlands, in all different communities, against this large-scale renewal. And these communities, they started clubs and they started discussion groups, and they protested against demolishments. And from this has derived an advanced way of approaching heritage. Heritage has become part of every step of approaching our built environment. Lots of buildings, of historic buildings, are protected. And it's not only buildings that are owned by the government that have heritage protection, but also a lot of private ownership has heritage protection. So because it almost went wrong, we steered all the way the other way, and we have developed a very embedded approach to heritage.
This approach is full of trade-offs, because if you think about sustainable building, it is much harder for a building that is 100 years old to achieve good results. It is easier for one that is built from scratch. Aren't you afraid that this carbon footprint or this emission efficiency of buildings will be inflated by this very clever approach to heritage in your country? But it has nothing to do with the thermal performance of buildings?
Yes, I don't have the exact numbers, but an element of reuse that is often forgotten is that there's a lot of material reuse. So you save a lot of carbon emission in reusing materials and constructions that are already there. If you demolish a concrete building, it's not good for the climate. It's best to reuse that structure. And it's the challenge, I think, to our field, to my colleagues in our field, to emphasize this more, that we already have so many what we call cascos, basic structures that we can reuse in different ways. It doesn't all have to be super precise in maintaining every brick and every window frame that's there, but we can reuse a lot of the more constructual elements of buildings. Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that it allows us to reduce the emissions associated with the production of all the elements that make up a new building. That is indeed a kind of saving for the environment. It is indeed a very interesting approach. It is estimated that in Europe, all buildings, those built before 1960, account for between 35 to 42%, depending on the region of Europe. These are huge figures, so we have buildings to adapt in Europe. Is your Dutch approach so international that it will work throughout Europe, or is it specific to your country?
Definitely not. No. It is definitely a way that others can use. I think already across Europe, it's not only the Dutch approach anymore. There's many different ways of reusing. Maybe to sum it up, I think in general there's 3 ways you can approach adaptive reuse. One is a very accurate restoration, conservation, maintaining everything from a building even though you're replacing materials. It's taking the material aspects of a building as your starting point for renewal. We do that all over. We're not the only ones who do this. The second one is adaptation by design. So you're introducing a very clear new layer to an existing building. Again, there's examples all over Europe. I'm thinking now about the Ruhrgebiet, the Zollverein, for example, in Germany, in the Ruhr area. Adding a very clear new layer, making a very clear new addition to a building that blends into the existing layers. So it's, accepting that history has many layers and you're there to add one new one to it. And the other one, maybe the last one, is a sort of non-designed adaptation. It's by using a building as a shell, for instance, a church or a factory, and adding new functions inside it that hardly adapt the shell of the building or the base of the building, but does make it usable for new functions for the people of our time.
For me, the symbol of this bold approach to building adaptation in the Netherlands is the Paradiso Club in Amsterdam. I'm a music fan. Music is my passion. Since 1968, groups like Nirvana, Sex Pistols, AC/DC have played in this club. Many legends of rock, metal and so on. But not everyone knows that the Paradiso Club is housed in a former church. Similarly, in Maastricht, for example, one of the most beautiful bookshops in the world is also located in a former church. And while in your country it seems quite natural, in countries like Poland, for example, or many others, something like that would probably not be culturally acceptable. And that's probably also what's important, that these cultural nuances matter, and there's no such thing as universality in all this, right?
No, I think definitely when it applies to churches or to religious buildings, we in the Netherlands have maybe a less strong bond with the religious meaning. I think that's also because we are religiously a very diverse society. The Paradiso example you mentioned is very interesting. It is a meeting center for a religious community, the Free Congregation, that was built in 1880. So it's a very classical building for those who don't know it. And in 1967, it was squatted by hippie music fans. Also very Dutch, I think, the squatting. It happened a lot at the time in Amsterdam. And very quickly it was opened as a youth club or as a music temple. So, there's still that reference to religion. We call it the music temple or the pop temple. It was opened in 1968. But what we have to realize is that they used the shell of the religious center and only added the technical aspects of a club. So the windows were kept, all the ornaments were kept, and they just added a stage. Of course, all of the technical elements of lights and sound, and then one balcony around the interior from where you could also see the stage. So that's a very interesting example of a very sort of low effort adaptive reuse. And now they are actually working on a more thorough adaptive reuse projects. They're extending, they're reevaluating how the building works for them. So it is a continuous story that has yet, to be finished. Yeah. And I think with maybe other buildings, maybe factories or buildings that have less societal meaning, we see it in other countries that there are even outside of Europe. Sesc Pompeii in Brazil is a very often used example. With factories, we do see that they are adapted to new uses. Yeah.
As we talk, words like church or castle often come up. We are talking about very old architecture now, but it won't be long before office buildings that seemed modern to us just a short while ago. Glass and aluminium, in many cases, already need some kind of adaptation. What is your idea in the Netherlands of how to adapt huge office buildings?
Yes, this is definitely a challenge. I think what we see in general is that the valuation and the appreciation of a building grows with time. So already the younger generations in the Netherlands appreciate the buildings from maybe the 1970s, 1980s more than maybe my parents do or the older generation do. The challenge is definitely also an aesthetic question. All the office buildings from the 1970s or 1980s are not all appreciated for their beauty. They have a very functional look about them. But what is important is that they are very large structures. And I mentioned already, the construction still works very well. It's still very sturdy and it can be adapted in many ways. So there we focus maybe less on the exact restoration, and, oh, this tile, you have to use it again, or this window frame, exactly, you have to use it again. But we think more about maybe the organization of a building, for instance. They often had a very a collective sense of the way that the floor plans were organized, with meeting rooms at the heart of the building, and from there continuing to more private office rooms. And that's also a very interesting concept that you can build on and that you can use in the adaptation of the building. So maybe focus more on constructional elements or spatial elements or organizational elements and less on the aesthetic element.
The investor, the owner of a building, often faces a dilemma because if he has an old building, it seems that the easiest and the quickest thing to do is to demolish it and build a new one in that place. However, if he decides to adapt it in some way, he can, for example, divide the space into smaller ones to make more flats. He can add something, for example, add a few floors or simply change the role of this building. Are these investors somehow supported to adapt rather than demolish? Because it seems that tearing down and creating a new one is the quickest and the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's the fastest way. Maybe it's considered the fastest way because it's the way that also we in the Netherlands or commercial parties mostly approach the built environment. Newer is what we do most, so it's easier, and I completely understand that point of view. But there are some ways in which here in the Netherlands, and maybe you also in Poland, or it can be an inspiration, are motivated to look again at the building that they own. And of course, one is financial. There are in the Netherlands financial supports for instance, making historic building, also more recent historic buildings, more sustainable. So there are financial funds in this. In the Netherlands also there are different rules, building rules or requirements for older buildings. So if you are reusing an older building, there's the numbers that you have to achieve, in carbon emission, for instance, are slightly different. So of course it's very different to reuse an old building than in designing a new one. Different rules apply. But of course there's also a more cultural or a more personal approach, and that is that buildings tell a story. And what if all the medieval people and the Renaissance people had all demolished their building? We would feel very different towards them. History tells the story, and history makes us into who we are. And it's very important that all layers of that history are reflected into our built environment. It's the reflection of who we are as a people. So I hope that people feel this connection to historic buildings or can rebuild that connection even to more recent historic buildings, because I feel that as a people, we have an obligation to make to make the world future-proof for our children and the people that come next. But it's also by passing on the stories that we were told as children, not only by our parents, but also by the world we grew up in.
In countries where monarchies once ruled, well, castles naturally just became museums. After all, there is still a king in the Netherlands, so it is not as if these castles have suddenly become museums. The royal family probably resides in many of them, or they have other roles than in many other European countries. But renovating such buildings is also a huge challenge because it is also a question of energy, of powering these buildings. How do you deal with this kind of fabric, sometimes urban, which has a very long history?
Czasami miejską, która ma ogromnie długą historię.
Yes, this is a very interesting question because here in the Netherlands we've only been a monarchy since 1815. So our monarchy is actually very recent. And in contrast to other European countries, we went from a republic to a monarchy. So our monarchy is relatively young in that sense. That doesn't mean, of course, that we don't have castles and palaces, because before the monarchy there were, of course, other counts and sort of, the elite of the time that lived in large houses like this. Now I have maybe two examples that come to my mind. One is at Binnenhof, the inner court, which is the space in The Hague where for 8 centuries, mostly our government has resided. So the government has changed from counts to what we call stadholders, which are representatives from that came after the counts. And then republic government, and now, of course, the more democratic government. And the Binnenhof is not one large palace or one large building that maybe you see in other countries. It's actually a collection of different buildings built over time, from medieval times to the 1980s, 1990s. And this is, to me, this tells the story of the Dutch built environment. It's adding new buildings and new layers every time that we need it, without demolishing the ones from the past. At the moment, there's large-scale renovation at the Binnenhof, at the inner court in The Hague, because it wasn't taken care of very well for the past 100 years. Because we feel like, in the Netherlands, the government feels like they have to be sober and not investing too much in themselves. So now there's large-scale renovation, and it's very complex because technical systems are very old. There's a water issue because it's right next to a very large pond. So it's very complex to adjust this age-old, this centuries-old ensemble of buildings. Of course, we also have palaces. So the other project that comes to mind is Paleis Het Loo, Palace Het Loo, which means basically palace, the forest, if you translate it directly. It's in a beautiful surroundings in the middle of the country, and it was the palace of kings and queens have lived there as a sort of summer residence. And this palace has been transformed into a museum. So the gardens are very beautiful. They've been completely brought back to their historic position. And the palace was made into a museum. And for doing that, they made a very large basement with a very modern outlook, or a very modern design. And from there, so from that sort of marble-clad basement, you now enter the palace. So in that way, we have similar challenges when it comes to conserving our palaces and letting them tell the historical stories of our country. Yeah.
Usually, when we talk about the Netherlands and building adaptations, well, we talk about the most interesting ones. But are there any adaptations that were not successful? Despite the analyses, even though a new role was given to these buildings, did it turn out that either the architectural changes were controversial or this new role simply did not work?
I think when it comes to controversial, they're almost always controversial because it's we feel connected to buildings that are telling our stories. I think it's the same for the Polish. You feel connection to your environment and to the ways that you know your environment. So controversial, always. There's always 100 ways to do it differently. Of course, there's also maybe adaptations that are considered slightly less effective, or that are not detailed in the way that reaches the quality that you would like. I'm not going to name out any of those projects, but maybe to name one controversial building. I'm here in Rotterdam, the second city of the Netherlands, and here we have a very large post office. And Rotterdam is a city of renewal. It was bombed very extensively during the World War, and it now prides itself, rightly so, as a city of renewal and of thinking forwards. This post office was built, it's a quite classical building. It was built just before the war, and it was mostly kept, apart from the wing in the back. So the back wing was demolished by bombing. And now they are constructing a high-rise tower on the place of that wing. So they've demolished that wing again, even though it has been reconstructed, and they're building a tower there. And it's very interesting because you're keeping the old building as the base for this new tower. But of course, there's also an emotional connection to this building. It was one of the few buildings in the city center that survived mostly the bombing. So it was one of the few buildings that was kept. So people are asking, why do we have to place a new structure on one of the only buildings that we have kept after the war? It's an emotional discussion. It's very good that all, everyone from the community is involved in this discussion. It's a discussion that I think is important to all the people in Rotterdam. But there's different ways of looking at it. You know, you can look at it in different ways. Yeah.
So where is that line? Where respect for history ends, this new life begins? This is probably difficult to define, isn't it? Because on the one hand, when we change the function of a building, sometimes it can be perceived as a disrespect for a historical issue of some kind, which is, after all, linked to that building to times of tragic history, like you mentioned Rotterdam, which was bombed. Warsaw was leveled to the ground. It is also such an example of a city that rose from the rubble. How can we ensure that this respect for a sometimes tragic history is felt? And how much can we afford to indulge in certain changes in function and form?
Yes, this is of course different with every site. I think it depends very much on maybe on the heaviness of the memories that we connect to sites. Sometimes a site has very bad memories and you have to approach it very differently than a site that has very good memories. Collective memory, of course, I'm talking about. So the boundary is very difficult to define in general, but it is not very difficult to define if you're focusing on a specific building. Here in the Netherlands, participation is becoming ever more important, participation of the community, of the collective. And I think it is very interesting and important to speak with the people before you approach a building. Of course, there is a vision as an architect. You as an architect are the person who has maybe the best way of guiding your imagination into an architectural approach. But by starting with conversations with the people who use the building or the people who lived around the building, you can get a sense of what it means to people. And from there, with them, and of course, with your expertise as an architect, you will find that if you take these two things into account, the new use and the new additions are more easily accepted by the people. They feel like they have become part of that reuse story instead of only the story of the old building or site.
To what extent, then, is this voice of the people relevant? Is there frequent public consultation on such projects? Or are there any surveys, votes?
Yeah, the ambition is to do this. Of course, it doesn't always happen. I have to be honest here. We also have faults. We have many faults. But it does happen more and more that, for instance, in an inner city reconstruction, you start with a large room of people who live there, who work there, with other memories there, and you present to them what you're going to do. And it's important to not do this at the end, when everything has been decided. It's important to do it in the first phases, so that you can still be inspired by the stories that they tell you. It's not only for them, to know what you're about to do, but it's for you to hear from them and be inspired by their stories in your design approach or in your reconstruction approach. Yeah.
And what was the most challenging project you were involved in?
Many are difficult. I've already mentioned the Binnenhof in The Hague. That was a very complex project. I'm thinking now, what else can I say? Yes, maybe for instance, the military base. I'm going to talk about this more generally. Military bases around the country, they are still used, of course, but they have a very layered history. Of course, there's a history of our own military successes and failures, but there's also the history of the German time at those military bases. So, and also of the Cold War. There's also structures of the Cold War on these places. So it's a very maybe charged, heavily charged places that we have to approach in making them usable. They're very functional places. They're still used by the military, but they also tell many stories of our recent past that are important to keep telling. So how do you approach a building or a site that has a very strong memory, both good and bad, while also making it function and according to its current needs? That's a very complex question that I think we all face. Yeah.
We've already discussed the most difficult project. And what was the greatest one, the one you remember the best, the result of which fills you with pride?
Yeah, we have worked on many zoos here in the Netherlands, both in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam. And of course, zoos are a place of happiness, of happy memories as a child. It's always good to research or to work on a project where you have memories as a child. But of course, there's also some recent societal developments where we look different at caging animals. So zoos here in the Netherlands, they face the dual challenge of caring for the animals that they still have, while also maybe taking a more societally accepted approach to all the sort of animal and nature environment in the world. But these zoos, in particular in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, they have a very interesting set of historic buildings that were designed with the idea of pleasure and relaxation, and also the more tropical sense, you know. So there we see we see a blend of Dutch architecture with references to architecture from all over the world. And there are beautiful ensembles of buildings here that we want to keep, even though the function of zoos is slightly changing. Yeah.
Here, another challenge had to be that normally residents can sometimes be asked about certain issues. Here, the main inhabitants of the zoo had a hard time asking their opinion because animals could not express it. But as I understand it, they like it?
Yes, I hope they do. They are caged, so I don't know if they like it. But of course, zoos have many people working there as well. So we have definitely consulted the people who work in the zoos and discuss with them in the ways in which the buildings can choose. But unfortunately, we were not able to ask the penguins and the tigers what they thought about their surroundings. You are right.
Let's leave the Netherlands for a moment, and maybe you have some nice examples of how buildings in Europe have been adapted in an interesting way. Maybe you even have some examples in Poland that provide a good model.
Yes, I'm gonna not work with I don't know the Polish names, but I think there are everywhere in Central Europe, there are, the silos, the very big infrastructural sort of elements, or agricultural or factory structures where that are very difficult to demolish and also very important in the cityscapes that we have, or in the landscape that we have. And it's always very interesting to look at how they reuse these structures. I'm thinking now of one in Germany, in Hamburg, where they've made it into a sort of museum or into an sort of, how do you say it, an experience to walk through and to experience how much concrete is there. And yeah, I think it's always very interesting there how the larger concrete structures are made visible to the public. You know, you can see the way that they were constructed. Yeah.
In my opinion, good examples of interesting adaptation are such buildings that have been given a new life, such post-industrialism, that is, old factories, workshops that have become shopping centres, or also cultural centres. These are also interesting adaptations. But do I understand correctly? The word renovation is not enough, is it? Because renovation is associated with repainting, with renovating just a building, and this adaptation or this adaptive architecture, is that a step further?
Yes, adaptive reuse says something about the way that you change a building. Renovation is mostly a material question. If we're looking at the terminology, of course, it's mostly about the approach to the existing materials and how you're conserving them and making them future-proof. Adaptive reuse is more about the architecture of things. So how you approach an old site in the adaptation for the new use. Reuse, how can you reuse an existing structure, adding new layers, adding new materials, adding new functions? That's a larger question. It's also about materials, but it's also about space, about people, about architecture, about design. Yeah.
So this adaptive reuse is a path from which the Netherlands, as I understand it, will not deviate and will still surprise us with interesting projects in the future.
Yes, I think it's in our blood. We will not be able to say goodbye to this approach. And yeah, I hope it can be an inspiration to other countries and that those countries can also inspire us in our approach.
Vita, thank you very much for this conversation. I think it was very inspiring for us all. And I already invite you to the upcoming Future Builders talks. Thank you, and see you there.